Hey everyone, welcome back to Anime Stark. Today, we're exploring a crazy what if. What if Deku replaced Thor in the Avengers? How would the team change, and can Deku fill Thor's shoes? Let's find out. Izuku was all dressed up. For the time being, he wouldn't be patrolling Japan for a while, as he was taking a few days off. Wearing a white shirt and a well-designed black tuxedo, the boy had cut his curly hair into a more mature one. He had turned 20 a few months ago and was poised to finish in the top 10 in the world. His signature red boots were replaced with brand-name leather shoes. Ironically, the income the government was providing him at the time was excellent. These were some of the benefits of being ranked in the top 10 of the best heroic prospects in the nation of Japan and being one of the 10 most powerful beings in the world. It had been a year since the villain war in Japan. Finally, it was all over. Izuku and his colleagues defeated the League of Villains and the Liberation Army under their command. How they achieved this was due more to sacrifice. Many heroes lost their lives in the battle, families and classmates alike were lost. But life was like that, and they had to honor their memories by making the world a better place. Izuku would make sure of that. Walking through the halls of a large technology company, Izuku kept thinking about everything he had been through during a full year of trials, failures, sacrifices, and overcoming challenges. After Shigaraki's defeat, the government waited no longer and decided to kill everyone involved in the great and tragic devastation that had taken place. With the help of incorruptible individuals, they were able to identify All for One's followers and the entire Liberation Army. After their whereabouts were determined, they were arrested, and a problem that had lasted more than 100 years was finally rooted out. After the great battle, all the heroes were injured. They were immediately treated by large medical corporations, both national and international. Unfortunately, Izuku was so damaged that his body remained irreparably damaged, and his arms would never be useful again. Wounded like that, Izuku was about to give up his heroic career if it weren't for David's shield, who moved heaven and earth to find Izuku and subject him to an unofficial procedure that would help him immensely. This procedure would utilize resources that villains had longer than they had. They would utilize the science of artificial quirk transplants. Izuku was the first legal participant. This procedure was an event that turned Izuku's life around. By undergoing a quirk transplant, which was successful, he gained the regeneration quirk. Now Izuku could be a hero without limits. With his body restored to its former glory, he spent all his time in quiet peace, mastering 100% of his power once and for all, managing to stand out as one of the most powerful beings in the world. Once upon a time, All Might hoped that Izuku was at least 10 times more powerful than his predecessor, and the media compared him to All Might in his former glory days. However, in reality, Izuku was at least 100 times stronger than his master, which had taken his abilities to something beyond. With the doubts left by Shigaraki during the battle, All Might could no longer hide his secret. With the help of some heroes and their vows of silence, All Might made his legacy known to the world and introduced the hero Izuku Midoriya, known as Deku. Izuku's fame soared to the stars. He was allowed to wear certain clothes and objects that would otherwise be prohibited. His personality was not affected, although his dominance in front of cameras improved, not to mention the state of maturity he had to achieve by force. After participating in a festival, Izuku won the grand prize, a paid vacation wherever he wanted to go. Izuku and his mother simply went to America, to the United States, to spend time with his father, who was from there. After a call from Melissa, Izuku took a flight and departed for Island to attend to his friend's emergency. She claimed she had a project with his father and needed his assistance. So the hero couldn't refuse the scientist's insistence. After taking his flight, this was because the airports were cancelled due to an approaching storm, but Izuku didn't mind the problem and took his flight on his own. After all, his abilities allowed him to travel through the air to any location in the country or continent if he so desired. Upon arriving at Island, he headed to David's industry. Wearing his best outfit to meet his friends, he went directly to the receptionist. Standing in front of the large technological counter, he simply spoke. "Good afternoon, I'm Izuku Midoriya. I have an appointment with David Shield, are you waiting for me?" Izuku explained to the receptionist. She kindly replied. "Yes, Mr. Shield is waiting for you," the receptionist said, nodding. "Thank you, I'll go up then," Izuku said, but was interrupted by the receptionist. "Wait. I'd like to ask you a favor," the receptionist asked, somewhat nervously, confusing Izuku. Noticing the young man's tension, she simply spoke. "You see, my son is a big fan of yours and would like to ask for your autograph. Today is his birthday and I'd like to surprise him with his favorite hero's signature. Could you give it to me, please?" The receptionist explained as she took out a heroic magazine. It featured Izuku on the cover, one of the most powerful heroes in the world, he was in the top 10. Smiling, Izuku took the magazine and took out a pen. After signing it, he headed towards David's office. Certainly, that was how great his fame was, but it was inevitable when you are the legacy of a legend. After that small mishap, Izuku headed to the top floor of the large building, where the people he would meet were. Upon entering the office, he was greeted by the sweet Melissa, who was now smaller than Izuku. "Izuku, how are you?" she said, very happy, while hugging Izuku affectionately. "Melissa, I'm fine, thanks to you," he said, separating from the girl's hug to shake the hand David offered him. "It seems you're stronger and bigger than last time. Your new abilities suit you very well," David said, smiling. "Thanks to you, now I'm more than I imagined I would be. Let's just say the treatment you gave me made me stronger," Izuku explained, smiling. "I'm glad to hear that, son," David said happily as Izuku walked in. "Well, how can I help you?" Izuku asked, since he couldn't find a reason for how he could be of help, no matter how he thought about it. David calmly explained a summary of what Melissa had in mind. "As you know, today's technology advances exponentially. Eventually, quirks have exponentially helped the development of new inventions, opening hypothetical frontiers and making reality what was considered fiction in our society. My daughter and I discovered a way to create a revolutionary new invention, and you need to see it," David said calmly. "And what do I have to do with this?" Izuku asked, somewhat confused. However, Melissa just smiled and answered. "You are the most important element, Izuku. You will be the energy we need for our invention to work," Melissa explained, as David continued explaining. "Let's proceed with the operating procedure of the device. Join us, Izuku," David offered enthusiastically, as they headed out of the office and he followed. After descending to the experimentation and testing area, Izuku was taken to a large room where there was a large device that left him surprised. In this large space, the device had two metal columns suspended from it, and in the middle was a large arch with some blue neon designs at each corner and hatches at the edges. Gigantic cables and platforms were on the sides, and everything converged in a large, gigantic circle on the arch. That device was about 4 to 6 meters in size and was inside an isolation cabin, while its connections protruded from the walls connected to a control cabin that was 10 meters away from the device. Izuku stared in disbelief at something that seemed obvious but illogical. Is it?" Izuku asked, astonished. Proudly, Melissa answered. "Of course it is, it's the first teleportation machine," Melissa exclaimed with great joy. "How is it possible?" Izuku asked. "With the help of third parties, I was able to find parts of the League's technology, as well as some notes, who used the science of quirk transplantation for their technological and biological advancements. By decoding some notes, I created a verifiable theory that would allow me to build a gateway that connects to any location in this plane of reality without the need for a quirk. With my device, we can teleport wherever we want," Melissa explained, mentioning that she had to dig deep into the underworld to obtain some information. "Oh, I understand," Izuku said, somewhat uncomfortably. Trying to forget the fact that he might have the authority to arrest David and Melissa for confessing that they were still involved in shady matters, he tried to avoid the kind of conversation. In the end, a scientist can even fall into masochism just for having the pride to shout Eureka. Understanding the point, David took the reins of the conversation and, somewhat embarrassed, changed the subject to continue explaining. "As Melissa was saying, I managed to refine the hypothesis and create a machine that can open a door to any part of the world whenever you want," David said while Izuku tried to forget Melissa's words. "Oh, that sounds great. Implementing portal science in the industrial market, as a hero, would be beneficial," Izuku said, smiling, but Melissa's spirits suddenly fell. "That would be true, but there's a problem," Melissa said with some regret. "What's the problem?" Izuku asked. "Energy. When we charge the energy containment centers, the machine consumes all the energy when it turns on. That causes it to only last 10 seconds before running out of charge and shutting down." "And can't they use another alternative energy source?" Izuku asked, but Melissa replied. "Izuku, there is no energy source that can keep the machine running. Even nuclear power is insufficient while it's controlled. Besides, using that resource could be dangerous, so there is no source that can sustain it," Melissa said pityingly as Izuku nodded in understanding. Then, Izuku's mind understood his role in this project. "Wait, do you think Izuku asked, surprised, looking for a smile from David. "You already realized, and yes. We believe that you can be sufficient to provide energy to the machine," David said. "But how?" My powers don't work that way, you know that. Izuku said, so David decided to explain. You see, there is only one possibly sustainable energy source for the machine to function, but it is so harmful, unpredictable and dangerous that it would not be used unless it is the last option. However, there was someone who possessed such great physical strength that his physical attacks generated a release of kinetic energy as powerful as a nuclear explosion. Sadly, that man is no longer with us, and to date there has been no one who can match his power. Until now. David was saying, referring to One for All. Understanding the point, Izuku understood what he had to do, and David added. We believe that you could generate enough energy to last 24 hours. We just need your cooperation, David asked, and Izuku simply nodded. I have no problem with that. When do we start? Izuku said excitedly, causing Melissa to burst with joy. Right now. I prepared a suit for you to wear, Melissa said, dragging Izuku to a changing room. After half an hour, Izuku was inside some kind of rotating wheel about 10 meters in diameter. With a drop of sweat, Izuku deduced that Melissa had something to do with the design of the device he was in. This measurement looked like a hamster, literally. He wore a gray suit with bright green neon lines, as well as a metal mask that had a thin layer of the material his suit was made of. Looking towards the cabin from where Melissa and David were, he spoke with some curiosity and discomfort. Do I really have to be in something like this? And what does this machine do exactly? Izuku asked. Well, excuse me for the shape of the machine, Melissa designed it, David began, somewhat embarrassed, while Melissa continued to express sweetness when looking at the machine. For her, her inventions and the one who carried them were cute. Avoiding his daughter's childish reactions, David proceeded to explain the most basic of how the machine worked. As you can see, this machine isn't a simple hamster wheel. It's designed to absorb the kinetic energy you generate while running on the wheel, converting it into fuel for the teleportation machine. As you might guess, unlike All Might, you can reach speeds below the speed of light for extended periods. Only you, in the entire world, can do that. But that means such a dangerous power could wreak havoc all around you. If you decided to run at full speed, you'd sweep across the world and wreak such devastation that the tectonic plates would shift. And that's just speculation, David explained, earning Izuku's approval. Of course, after restoring my power, I've become much more powerful, Izuku said seriously. Now his power was a responsibility he had to exercise, protecting the world from itself. Well, that's not a problem for us. As long as you're inside this machine, you can run as fast as you want without holding back, and you can give me the energy of an entire nuclear plant per second. David explained. But can you contain all that energy? Izuku asked. Sure, just stay within exactly 10 seconds. Or we'll all die when the entire island is erased in a burst of kinetic energy. David explained. What? Izuku exclaimed, alarmed. Apparently, he must have thought very carefully about lending his help to this crazy family. Let's begin. Melissa said as she pressed the button to activate the machine Izuku was in. Okay, let's begin. Izuku said, sighing. Surprisingly, Izuku released a layer of energy over his body that spread out like a wave. Now, more powerful than ever, the accumulated energy of One for All was visible. Consequently, Izuku had changed his appearance slightly by using 100% of his power. His hair stood on end, pulsing with a very luminous emerald-colored energy in each strand. So much so that it displayed an intense glow throughout the entire place. His fair skin had a thin layer of energy that made it glow like a lamp. Furthermore, a kind of lights, which looked like bright lights or small galaxies on his skin, adorned his body. In short, he looked like a human star, full of galaxies. Ready, Izuku prepared to adopt the position that speedsters normally take. All right, begin, David Shield said, watching as Izuku began to move, or rather, as the wheel began to spin. The machine's wheel spun so fast that the collected energy shone intensely, like a blinding light. Despite not appearing to be moving anywhere, Izuku was moving his legs so fast that they were no longer visible to human perception. David, attentive to every second, couldn't allow even a second more. Otherwise, the energy container would explode and literally wipe out the island. David sweated as he gripped the communicator, which had a recording accelerated exactly to the speed at which Izuku was moving. The extraction took half of a 10-second, the other half of that second was the time in which David's signal was transmitted, followed by Izuku's immediate descent as he stopped powering the energy container. Stop! Came David's recorded voice, causing Izuku to stop abruptly. Melissa, meanwhile, disconnected the power source from the already full battery, thus avoiding the recoil Izuku released when he stood up. Succeeding in this was a great relief to the two scientists. Had they failed, only Izuku would have survived such a powerful explosion. Okay, let's activate the portal. You can come in, Izuku, David said, looking at the machine Izuku was in. It was almost melted and red hot due to the friction the young man had to generate in just 10 seconds. Izuku began to levitate in the air and flew directly toward the command cabin, leaving the containment room. With David and Melissa present, Izuku deactivated his power and approached the scientist family. Everything went well, right? Izuku asked. We're breathing, that means everything was a success, Melissa said, leaving her father somewhat embarrassed. The girl didn't know how to measure her words, and that was a problem. Izuku, for his part, thought she would definitely think things over 3, even 4 times, before doing another favor for these people. Looking at the portal machine, the 3 of them saw how, from one moment to the next, the device started up normally. Creating a celestial deformation inside the circular piece, more strange lights joined together, forming an arc that expanded until it reached 5 meters in diameter. Marveled, Izuku observed another distinct passage inside the hole. This one showed a snowy landscape, all white. It seemed to be the Arctic. Is that the South Pole? Izuku asked, surprised. In fact, it is the North Pole. And yes, it is functioning normally, David said, smiling. Izuku simply thanked him. I give you my gratitude for helping me with this. Next time there won't be as many risks as now, David said with some sadness. I really hope so, Izuku replied, feeling somewhat uncomfortable. Now he had to avoid getting involved in so many illegal things that he would have to report as a hero. Avoiding those thoughts, he considered that the test with David was over. Well, our machine works. We can turn it off. Turn it off, Melissa. David said, feeling accomplished. Sure. Melissa answered while using a computer in her hands. However, something as unexpected as the behavior of nature occurred. Evidently, this was due to the storm. The same storm that forced the airlines to close and that made Izuku use his leave so he could use his quirk. Neither Izuku, nor David, nor Melissa could have imagined that within that storm there was also great electrical chaos. Users of portals, dimensions, or teleportation have one thing in common: they can't cross areas with electromagnetic fields. Most can barely manage to break that law. However, there are also others who have the weakness of attracting electricity. These generally can't use their abilities in cloudy or stormy weather. It would be like condemning their body to be struck by lightning simply by attracting it. In the case of the portal in front of them, it unfortunately suffered from the second problem. This meant that, practically speaking, it was a bad move to try to turn it on that day. The portal required a lot of energy. In return, it offered a gateway to unlimited places. However, when it comes to being in weather like this, and in the worst conditions, that meant the entire thunderstorm would be attracted. But unfortunately, the 3 individuals didn't know that. Suddenly, loud thunderclaps struck the entire building. A column of lightning began to sweep through the entire building, destroying windows and circuits, which knocked out the entire security system. Glass exploded along with nearby buildings, and the roar was even heard loudly in the experimentation area. Alarmed, Izuku activated 100% of his power and looked at everything that was happening around him, attentive. What's going on? Melissa asked, scared, while David took the computer from his daughter's hands in a panic. My God, the portal attracted the electrical storm. It's feeding off of it and we can't stop it. David was looking at the readings on the computer. The portal began to go beyond its established limits, losing its light blue glow and transforming into gold. In an instant, it changed its snowy surroundings to a kind of golden tunnel that began to suck in everything around it. In a swift movement, Izuku grabbed Melissa and held her while he began to levitate to resist the suction. Damn, something complicated always has to happen in this place, Izuku complained uneasily and frustrated, seeing that he couldn't hold out for that long without hurting the 2 people in his arms. I'll get you out of here, Izuku said, putting his effort into flying towards the cockpit. Managing to reach the door, Izuku left David and Melissa in a safe area while he faced the machine. Approaching a large 2-ton piece, he took it in his hands and pointed it at the machine with the intention of destroying it. Izuku, don't do it, David shouted through the communicator, but it was too late. As the machine was destroyed, a burst of remnant energy from the portal expanded throughout the cabin, striking Izuku. After being hit, this same energy was collected in a millisecond, and as if it were a portal, Izuku was drawn into it and disappeared from the scene. Waking up heavily, Izuku got up from where he was. It was a comfortable bed, but something strange didn't feel right. The good thing was that he was whole and apparently hadn't died. Also, it seemed that the suit hadn't suffered many problems, it was complete and looked normal. Well, the title of most powerful human on his planet had to be good for something. As he looked around the room, which seemed like a militarized chamber, Izuku simply questioned one thing: where was he? Izuku opened his eyes. He didn't question why he felt so comfortable or why he had lost consciousness when he was sucked in. He didn't know how to react to recent events and simply yawned heavily. Feeling his brain click, Izuku was startled by the fleeting thought he almost let slip: was he sucked in? Yes, he was sucked in. The portal, Izuku exclaimed, now flustered, as he looked around. Izuku was on a stretcher, inside a strange, enclosed room. There was nothing but a table and white walls. Just as he was about to get out of bed, a female voice made him realize that he wasn't the only one in the room. "Slow down, pretty boy, there's no rush," were the words of the woman he had his eyes on. Her skin was fair, and her eyes were green. She had short, wavy red hair. She didn't wear makeup, yet her beauty stood out alongside her beautiful, red lips. Normally, Izuku was startled by beauty, but he wasn't in the mood for games right now. Besides, something told him this woman wasn't just any woman, and in part, he attributed it to what she was wearing. She was wearing a full black suit, with the zipper half closed, leaving part of her bust exposed, but it wasn't something that concerned Izuku at the moment. On her forearms, she wore some artifacts the same color as her suit. Her outfit definitely gave her away. Ignoring the woman's words, Izuku sighed and then spoke. "I'm afraid so, miss. I'm in a hurry, I have to go," Izuku said to the woman, who asked, confused. "And where do you want to go?" the woman asked. Izuku, thinking she was a colleague, spoke naturally. "Well, I have to go to Shield Industries," Izuku said, while the woman expressed surprise. "Shield Industries? Interesting. And what do you plan to do there?" the woman asked again, while Izuku answered. "Sorry, but it's confidential." "Sorry, but who are you?" Izuku asked, somewhat puzzled. Strangely, despite the conversation, he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Evidently, Izuku didn't know every name of every hero in the world, but as a former heroic otaku, he had extensive knowledge of American heroes. Furthermore, they were the first to forge the heroic profession, after all. Considering this, he added the fact that, as one of the greatest celebrities in superhuman society, he had already had both administrative and personal contact with most of the heroes in North America, approximately 85%. He had also had some contact with countries on that continent, such as Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and others. This was to get to know the heroes and the number one hero of Brazil, the second most powerful in the world. The reason for his relationship with them was because he personally collaborated with a heroic federation to establish a heroic academy and agency districts in low-income countries in Latin America. The truth was, in those lowlands, there were people with the potential to even warp space. That meant those people were powerful, and all for one, in the past, had taken advantage of many gifts in that part of the world to resurrect the dead and create nomas from corpses. With the Federation's support, Izuku supported the underground heroes of the lowlands, who were now legal heroes in the eyes of the public and the government. But at that moment, he couldn't connect the beautiful woman's face to an American heroine or another for a change. So, this only meant one thing: either he didn't know who she was and that was it, or he was in trouble. And consequently, Izuku opted for the latter. His experience made him cautious. When Izuku asked, the woman responded kindly. "Call me Alice Pixman, it's a pleasure. Sorry I didn't introduce myself sooner. It's just that I saw you, and you jumped," the woman said, feigning embarrassment, accompanied by a smile. Izuku questioned. "How strange. You must trust me a lot to just tell me your name like that, right?" Izuku said, leaving the woman somewhat confused. "Well, why would I have to hide my name? Are you someone dangerous?" the self-named Alice asked jokingly, laughing. At the woman's words, Izuku matched his smile by answering. "Definitely not, I'm anything but dangerous. I thought American heroes didn't usually use real names, only pseudonyms. I mean, 45% of the heroic mortality rate is due to that very thing. And of that 45%, 35% are in the United States, after Japan, in the last 5 years." Izuku said, smiling, while the one called Alice explained why she gave herself away. "Well, I'm a different kind of heroine, after all," the woman said, knowing that he'd already figured her out. Up until that moment, at the back of the room, a small, dark window could be seen, very wide and rectangular. Nothing could be seen but the reflection of the only two in the room and a camera on the back wall, above their heads. On the other hand, on the opposite side of the window, A full booth and 3 men inside could be seen, watching the young man looking through the glass. Up until that moment, they hadn't understood what the boy was referring to, as he only talked about being in a hurry, heroes, the mortality rate of heroes, and other fictional things that seemed straight out of a pirate comic or a highly acclaimed Asian story. But it all hinged on one thing: the portal he'd mentioned when he woke up. Without further ado, someone spoke. "I honestly don't understand what the boy is talking about," a young man said in confusion. He had short blonde hair, his skin was somewhat tanned, and his eyes were blue, which matched the tight shirt he was wearing. This reflected his true masculine figure, the body of a super soldier. "Unlike that man," another spoke. "But I partially understand what you're saying. It's obvious that that boy is proof of human existence elsewhere in the universe. From what he's saying, we can only think of two things: either he comes from a higher place than this, or he's just delusional," said an older man, impressed. He wore glasses and listened attentively to the words of the boy with the strange curly green hair. Like the younger man, the man had curly hair, but it was black. His eyes were brown, and he certainly didn't seem to have a great physique. He wore a purple shirt and, strangely, very baggy pants. Maybe what Mr. Banner says is true. But whoever it is, or whatever that thing is, fell from the atmosphere and caused a crater in the helicarrier, said a bald man wearing an eye patch over his left eye. His skin was colored and he dressed entirely in black, in addition to wearing a black leather trench coat and combat boots. He didn't give a damn whether he was human or not. So far, he had a more pressing problem, and that problem had a name: Loki. Yes, the god of lies from Norse mythology, Loki, was the biggest problem he had. This entity was in the world with an artifact stolen from him, and that artifact had the power and energy to easily destroy the world. The Lord couldn't stand another problem and had to make sure this thing, or whatever it was, wasn't theirs. Curious, the blond man they called Rogers looked confused as the boy looked from him to his colleague Banner, and finally to the man in the trench coat. Knowing something was wrong, he spoke. "Fury, is it my imagination, or is that boy watching us?" Rogers asked, but the man named Fury reluctantly shook his head. "Impossible. He wouldn't be able to see us even if he had a means to detect heat signatures," the man in the trench coat, Fury, replied. However, Banner began to have doubts. "Well, I wouldn't say the same," he said as he watched Izuku smile as he noticed Banner's eyes. Inside the room, Izuku jumped out of bed and looked at the woman. Sighing, he spoke seriously. "Why don't you tell your friends to please explain to me what this strange place is?" Izuku asked, but in return, the woman only flinched in surprise and joked. "What do you mean?" the woman asked, but Izuku only sighed heavily. He wasn't one for games and feared being in the worst situations, which could be two: being captured by a dangerous or villainous organization, or being in a dimensional plane outside of his reality. The latter sounded fictitious, and he knew it. But, weren't powers something fictitious? With that logic in mind, Izuku got out of bed, activating 100% of his power. Shining like a star again, he rose into the air, remaining static a meter from the bed. The first to be in disbelief was the self-named Alice, who said clearly, "Agent Romanoff reporting in. I need reinforcements in Sector 6 of Corridor A, Room B." She pointed her right arm at Izuku, while the artifact on her forearm glowed. On the other hand, Dr. Banner gasped in amazement at seeing someone wrapped in clean, pure energy in a unique way. Meanwhile, Rogers was holding only the shield resting on his right leg, an iconic shield with a star in the middle, accompanied by red and blue colors. Fury, on the other hand, had a brush with the past when he saw someone resembling a person he knows and who is no longer there, for the moment. As the room filled with guards in special suits, bearing a logo that said SHIELD, Izuku didn't care and simply levitated towards the window where they were spying. Izuku could see them clearly. Needless to say, those men backed away. Knowing the situation, Izuku spoke. "If you want to know if I'm dangerous, I'm not. I don't know who you are, but if you are bad people, I ask that you simply calm down and ask whatever you want. I will answer your questions. In return, you will answer mine. I hope you understand that, and I'm sure we'll get along well," Izuku said calmly, while the men just remained silent. In the end, they had a lot to talk about. In Astrucket, Germany. Screams and riots spread through a private establishment. Screaming people ran terrified out of the place. Crowds gathered, and authorities rushed to find out what the strange situation was. Elegantly, amid the screams and anguish of the people, someone stood serenely watching with amusement the chaotic events around him. Dressed in an elegant pine green suit with gold trim, the attire didn't seem modern, but neither did it seem related to anything contemporary. However, the strange man with fair skin and fine features wore a strange, striking helmet. And how could it not be? The same object had two extremely long horns, not to mention that it was golden and shiny. In addition, in his right hand, he carried a golden scepter, which held a gem as luminous as the blue sky. That man walked elegantly with his scepter in hand. He smiled as he heard the melody that reached his ears. He was filled with despair, and he boasted that he was the one responsible for this chaotic scene. He was certainly the one responsible for such a commotion, and he felt his vigor growing with the sound of the sirens of the authorities rushing in. Descending the steps of that important establishment, Loki turned his body in a specific direction, where the authorities were approaching in a hurry, while the patrol car's siren intensified the chaotic events. A devilish smile formed on his face distorted into a maniacal expression, and he smiled macabrely at the patrol car. With scepter in hand, he pointed it at the police car, and gripping the handle tightly, tensed the muscles in his arm. At the same time, the gem of that scepter began to shine intensely, easily illuminating the streets. And with a single thought, the scepter obeyed its wielder. From the scepter, a beam shot out with such force that Loki's arm recoiled from the propulsive force of the recoil. The intense light blue beam reached the patrol car and, in an instant, caused it to explode, destroying two more patrol cars that followed behind. Having finished off the first unit of authorities, Loki smirked at his sadistic display of power. Not content with tearing out a person's eye a moment ago, he thought of another way to amuse himself. He expressed his macabre gaze to the crowd running for their lives and safety. Seeing this, his body began to glow with a golden light, thinking about the next performance. As people moved forward to escape, the first in line stopped in terror when he saw what was right in front of him. A golden glow came out of nowhere, and a second later a second Loki appeared in front of them, saying the following. "Kneel down," the second Loki demanded with authority and arrogance, while the people looked for another way out. However, once again the people stopped when they saw another Loki in front of them, and just like the second one, it also expressed the same words. "Kneel down," demanded the other copy of Loki, expressing a sadistic smile. The more escape options appeared, the more copies reappeared out of nowhere, and the same words remained. "Kneel down." In the end, the people found nowhere to escape, and the copies were already blocking the way, trapping them. Mockingly, the original Loki approached the terrified people, while looking at them with arrogance and bloodlust. Then, in a fit of aggression, he shouted, "Kneel before me." "Now a wee," Loki shouted with sudden fury, while his voice deafened the people's ears, who fell to their knees, paralyzed by the Norse god who stood before them. And in order to stay alive, the people had only one choice: to obey. With grace and arrogance, Loki looked at the people who knelt before him. This brought a smile to his face, and he simply spread his arms as he saw how the people looked at him in terror. As he looked at the oppressed masses, Loki simply spoke. "Isn't this so simple? Isn't that their natural state? The truth is, humanity doesn't want to talk, they long to be subjugated. The seductive allure of freedom strips the joy from their lives. With their endless fights for power, a power they'll never achieve. By identity, they were created to be ruled. And in the end, they will always kneel." These were the words of a contented Loki, who passed among the oppressed people, like a shepherd with his sheep. With each word, no one dared to even look at his face. Everyone was too afraid to even consider the words he was saying. However, in the crowd, an old man grew tired of hearing these words, and he stood up bravely, standing as his age allowed. This action caught the attention of a confused Loki, who looked at the old man with confusion and interest. Having his attention, the old man spoke bravely. "In the end, we always kneel. But not to men like you," the old man said firmly to Loki, who simply let out a small, sinister laugh. "There are no men like me," Loki said, looking defiantly at the old man, who let out an annoyed, even though he was stoic. "You're certainly not the only one, nor the first. Tyrants will always exist, and they always will," said an old man, planting his feet firmly. This action wasn't at all pleasant for Loki, but with a smile, he thought of a solution and spoke arrogantly for everyone. "Listen to the old man, please. Let him serve as an example," Loki declared haughtily, as he pointed his scepter at a brave old man who never wavered. As expected, the scepter fired a beam of celestial light, intending to finish off the old man. However, from the sky at that precise moment, a distinctive subject fell. He was carrying a shield in his hand, the same shield with a star in the middle, and the distinct red and blue stripes. With the shield, he protected the old man from the deadly ray that was fired and thrown back. This ray, as expected, surprisingly hit Loki, sending him flying a few meters. That man stood upright before the people around him, and stepped down from a small platform. He approached Loki, and as he did, the devil, The last time I came to Germany, a man tried to outdo everyone else, and we ended up at odds, said the man, who was Rogers. However, this beast wasn't very practical for making a simple suit. His suit consisted of an entirely blue ensemble, as did his helmet, which was attached to a matching mask. However, red and white stripes adorned his sides, as did a star on his chest. As for Loki, he calmly got up from the ground, a sinister smile spreading across his face. "The soldier, who came from another time," said Loki, who had now stood up straight. "And you've got nothing left," said the great Captain America, while on his back, an airship hovered statically before Loki. A slot opened on its underside, and a heavy weapon emerged, pointed at Loki from above, and a female voice spoke through a loudspeaker from the craft. "Loki, drop the weapon and surrender," threatened Natasha, who was in command of the ship. On the other hand, Izuku was inside it to intervene when the moment required it. Izuku didn't have time to know his situation, or even get to know where he was. He only had to support these people, and now they needed him. In fact, they need all the help they can get, and he understood that. So for the moment, this Nordic problem was the issue to be resolved. At first, everything remained silent. However, Loki makes his first move known by launching a destructive ray at the ship that barely rode it. The destructive ray destroyed a large portion of a multi-story building, creating destruction at first glance. It meant one thing: the fight had begun. The captain didn't think twice, and threw his indestructible shield, hitting the god's chest. But surprisingly, this didn't affect the Nordic being, who felt no effect from the soldier's attack. This didn't discourage the captain, and he used his super speed to connect a powerful punch to Loki's jaw, but that only turned his face, surprising the captain. In the past, his strength was capable of breaking his neck or sending the heads of his enemies flying, after sending his body flying a few meters away due to the power. However, it was a god he faced, he was not in his times. On the other hand, that blow was an offense to Loki, who with his scepter hit the captain, who blocked the attack. However, the captain did not expect what happened with that blow. The blow caused the super soldier's legs to buckle, nearly knocking him to the ground, while the concrete floor beneath him crumbled to pieces from Loki's force. However, Loki threw an upward punch, hitting the bottom of the shield and exposing the soldier. Taking advantage of the opening, he slammed a blow into the patriotic soldier's side, sending him flying meters away. Rolling on the ground a few times, the captain got up, enduring the pain of the blow, and looked at the god with defiance. For him, this was personal. The captain launched an attack with his shield, but Loki collided with the shield, sending it flying a few meters away, while dodging the captain's punch. Furious, Loki launched a horizontal blow at the captain, but he ducked, avoiding having his head torn off. Loki threw another punch, but the captain dodged it with difficulty, while finding an opening to strike a vital spot on the Norse god. However, when the captain throws a hook to the side to Loki's ribs, the Norse god doesn't even flinch at the soldier's blows. And with the back of the center, Loki hits the captain again from behind, sending him flying like a rag doll meters away. It was more than evident that the captain was at a disadvantage, and he was already feeling the consequences of those blows that the god gave him. I never imagined you would find someone who would hurt him so much. When the captain was about to get up, he felt the end of the scepter on the back of his neck. He was cornered. "On your knees," Loki threatened, but he didn't count on the captain's speed, who simply responded by evading the scepter and striking the Norse god. "Not today," Captain America shouted, launching a flying kick at Loki's face, but it barely moved him. On the other hand, Izuku watched this interaction from the ship alongside Natasha. Knowing that it was enough, Izuku decided he had to forcefully make Loki stop. "I'm going out," Izuku said, watching Loki, who was catching Captain America and mopping the floor with him. The soldier was out of his league. "Wait, he's everywhere?" Natasha said with surprise and concern, seeing so many Lokis everywhere. It had to be the real one, or the fake one, and that was a problem. "I'll still go," Izuku said, outlining a plan of action, ready to battle. However, something unexpected happened. The ship's computer circuits distorted, and the speakers began to broadcast rock music. This surprised everyone given the recent events and made Izuku stop to see what was happening. And without warning, he heard another voice. "Agent Romanoff, did you miss me?" came a man's voice, which drew a smile from the woman, since she knew him. Curious, Izuku asked. "Who is he?" Izuku asked. Natasha on the other hand just answered. "An acquaintance," the woman said calmly. From high above in the middle of the night, a kind of rocket flew at high speeds towards the fight. However, when illuminated by the lights of the buildings and the lamps, Izuku was surprised, as were those present, since it was not a rocket. Rather, it was a metal body, a kind of red and gold robot that had arrived at the battle. It launched powerful rays from its metallic hands, impacting Loki, who was sent flying a few meters away, crashing him into a pavement and destroying him due to the impact. Without further ado, the newcomer landed in a heroic pose, cracking the ground at the same time. This has been attributed to the weight of the armor. After getting up in an epic manner, he points his hands, while multiple mini-missiles and destructive defense systems deployed from the metal suit. Izuku was surprised to see the robot, and in reality it was a mechanical suit of armor with a man inside it. Then, seeing Loki, the man in the armor speaks. "It's your turn, Horns," said the armored man, who simply aimed his hands and everything in his arsenal at the supposed Norse god in front of him. Meanwhile, Loki slowly stood up with fury, ready to fight. However, before the battle could resume, something stopped him. "Enough." Izuku's loud voice floated in the air, capturing the attention of everyone present, even those watching the fight scene in the area. "Incredible, a star joined the party," said the mature man, while the captain was relieved. "Midoriya," said the captain as he took his shield. As for Loki, he was simply surprised for a moment by what he saw. However, he simply suppressed his anger, and calmed down. For him, one opponent may be simple. Two may be reasonable, but three were a crowd. Especially the third, who radiated too much power. He was not in his plans. Izuku, on the other hand, flew towards the two closest to shield, and landed next to them. Looking at Loki, wrinkling his eyebrows, the facial expression of that Norse god became neutral. He began to glow, while his outfit disappeared and was replaced by a different one, a more casual one. As for the clones, they simply dissipated in golden light, leaving no trace. And seeing how the Norse god raised his hands, it was all over. Amidst the mist, beyond the cold mountains, the sky split in two, accompanied by the hum of a latent machine roaring in the sky. The state-of-the-art aircraft belonging to the armory moved through the air, slowly beginning to reach the sound barrier. Camouflaged in the fog by the midnight darkness, Agent Romanov was piloting the ship, pausing it on autopilot. Nick Fury was at the control screen, abreast of the mission that had just been completed an hour earlier. Izuku sat in the back, staring at the god before him, the god who tried to bare his soul with his eyes, even if he didn't utter a word. Also present were Captain America and the unexpected new member, a last-minute participant in the mission. His name was Tony Stark, the famously known Iron Man. Izuku felt a little fascinated by the appearance of that very narcissistic man. In fact, he was attracted to the equipment he had, and according to Natasha, it was created by the billionaire himself. An armor that has an exoskeleton that gave him incredible defense for his protection, increased strength and speed, similar to Captain America himself, and at the pinnacle of defense technology on this planet, he carried multiple high-powered gadgets, and almost infinite power in a mini-reactor that he carried in his chest to give him enough energy to move the suit, and equip it with propulsion energy for offense and air transport. Evidently, such technology was similar to the one he had in his world. Only less lethal due to the obvious restrictions when carrying technology similar to the ability that a quirk could give you. So, for obvious reasons, any technology of that caliber could only be used with incredibly expensive permits, or with heroic licenses. In any case, that suit was great, and he was impressed by the man's intellect. Maybe May or Melissa would like to meet some of that man's users, or maybe he'd learn from them. In any case, whatever the case, it would be something incredibly big. "So, has he said anything yet?" Fury asked through the communicator. He seemed overly serious, and somewhat stressed. Supposing he was being pressured too much by the leaders, and he wanted the right answers so he could clean up the mess he spilled with the disappearance of a weapon like the third act. An object still unidentified and unknown, capable of reducing the planet itself to interstellar dust. On the other hand, Natasha sighed in defeat and stress at the previous events, and had nothing but simple, unsatisfying words. "Nothing, sir," the agent replied without any bacillus, while monitoring the ship, camouflaging it to avoid the satellites. On the other hand, Izuku relaxed a little. Apparently, this would take longer than he had expected. But with his experience as a hero, he knew nothing would be easy, but not impossible. So he would just wait for things to calm down and then think about his situation as an extraterrestrial human refugee. The sound of a grunt from the communicator was as clear as day. Fury just wanted this immortal, cheap god to leave his planet, to crawl from where he came from, and to let him do his logistical work. So without any bacillus, he ordered. "Just bring him. We have little time," were Fury's last words over the communicator, cutting the link, leaving the silence expected by those present. Then, amid the silence and the movements, the captain cautiously approaches Tony. He approached a few inches from the billionaire's ear and spoke calmly, in a low voice. I don't like him. It was the only word that came out of the captain's mouth, expressing the bad feeling that had been eating away at him since the capture of the Norse god. He couldn't get it into his head that everything would end this way and without further ado. Knowing the god's capabilities beforehand, and above all the humiliation he experienced at the god's extreme strength, who treated him like a mere fly, he felt something was wrong. He seemed very calm, and his experience in war told him that this meant trouble. On the other hand, Tony was very opposed to the captain. Even Izuku could notice that the man seemed overconfident in himself and his armor. Perhaps because he could move at Mach 2 and have the power of an entire army, even resisting explosive impacts of C4, made him seem very confident in his armor. His arrogance and hint of charisma were evident in the air on his haughty face. What? The King of Rock would give up so easily? Tony joked calmly, while casually glancing at Loki. Natasha wasn't surprised to hear Tony's response. She had worked as his personal assistant for his company for a while, and knew what Tony was like beforehand. He obviously worked for Stark for reconnaissance and data collection, undercover for S.H.I.E.L.D. It was a somewhat stressful job considering everything he had to do to put up with the billionaire ex-arms man. Everyone knew that man had developed a weakness that would be fatal to the kind of person Tony belongs to. He had developed remorse. But even if he was in the process of caviar for the better, everyone he knew was aware that the alcoholic billionaire would have a long way to go before he could change, even if it were to happen, so until then, they would have to endure, for the moment, 80% of what Tony was. Clearly, Izuku could notice the captain's discontent, who felt uncomfortable in front of Tony. It was evident that the captain hated the ironclad man's attitude. It didn't seem that simple to me. He didn't even fight me with all his strength, that's why he just gave up like that seems strange to me. He saw us as mere puppets, he's too powerful, the captain said seriously, while looking at the sarcastic Tony's very careless gaze. So what? You're too strong for your age, were the sarcastic words of the Iron Man, who, apparently, was earning Steve's resentment. And to top it all off, he continued joking while looking at the captain. What do you do? Pilates? He asked. What? There was no need to say whose confusion it was. So, with some indifference and feigned disdain, Tony explained. It's an exercise. Well, you've missed out on a lot of things in your years as a kid, Captain Pallet, Tony said indifferently, while Captain America felt his focus slipping. As Steve was about to speak contemptuously toward Tony, but Izuku's voice approaching them caught Tony's attention. It would be good if you took this a little seriously. The things that are happening in this place are very serious. Izuku asked seriously, while Tony looked at him with a certain grace and arrogance. Sorry, kid. But this is an adult conversation. So, shoo, go play heroes while you light up. Tony joked calmly, while looking at Izuku, making gestures with his armored hand. On the other hand, Izuku just snorted a little. He already sensed what Romanus meant by Tony's superpower, it was very desperate. Therefore, Izuku talked about something that didn't make him proud, but that would bring Tony down a bit. At my job, I earn more than 6 million euros. I have 10 foundations where I earn something similar. I own 20 agencies around the world, and I am a unique icon of my kind. Besides, I have an entire planet that sponsors me. I think it's enough, considering my age for a child. Izuku said, surprising Steve, but not Tony, who simply puffed out his chest with arrogance. Nah, it's not enough for me. Tony said calmly, while Izuku just raised his hands in his defense. For me, it's more than enough considering I started from scratch, long before I was of legal age. Izuku explained calmly, while looking at a smiling and defiant Tony. You've already won my attention, boy of light. Tony said calmly. But between the exchange of words, Steve entered the conversation and spoke. Fury never mentioned your help. Captain America said seriously, facing Tony. However, the Iron Man rolled his eyes in exasperation and disdain, while he looked away at the bad weather that suddenly began to form unexpectedly. Izuku observed this seriously due to the recent unnatural event that began to hit the ship with powerful turbulence, much to the concern of Agent Romanos. Aha, there are many things that Fury doesn't tell you. Tony said sarcastically, paying attention to what was beginning to appear. The turbulence continued to increase, while lightning began to dance across the clouds and fogs charged with electrons and protons. Large flashes of lightning could be seen from the window of the frenzy, while those present noticed the expressionless surprise and concern of the Norse god of lies. And where's this coming from? Romanus said, very surprised by the events and the sudden flashes of lightning that gathered around her. She began to take control of the ship, while an incredible thunder passed very close to the ship, startling Romanus, and especially Loki. The latter kept looking at the roof of the ship constantly. This did not go unnoticed by Esteve, who addressed the Norse god who was in front of him. "What's wrong? Are you afraid of lightning?" the captain asked. Loki, however, looked away from the ceiling and saw the very patriotic man. Without further ado, he simply answered. "I'm not very happy about what's coming," Loki calmly confessed, claiming the hint that he knows what's going on. The Norse god looked up at the sky and smiled somewhat ironically. Even if his plans were somewhat altered in the calculations, everything was going according to plan. And that amused him. Then, from the darkest mists in the middle of the emptiness of the night, an unidentified object crashed into the ship, causing it to lose its course at times. The good thing about all this was that what crashed wasn't an object. The bad news is that they should have wished it were an object, and not a subject. Such a subject was at the top of the ship, while a strange, silvery object, lustrous like freshly polished metal, could be seen through the fleeting lights given by the lightning. Said mace-shaped artifact shone at each flat end, like some kind of writing that glowed in a neon blue light, while violent sparks of electricity escaped from it. As if the hammer represented the coming of the Lord of the Storm himself. Tony didn't hesitate for a second, and went to get his helmet to protect his fragile and powerful head. Meanwhile, Izuku approached Natasha, who was struggling to keep the ship flying. And while Captain America put on his helmet, Izuku spoke to Natasha, who was trying with everything she had to keep the ship stable. "Are you okay, Natasha? Can you keep the ship?" Izuku asked, while Natasha nodded. She was very focused, trying to stabilize her movement amidst the constant gaps in the air. So while she was incredibly focused, she answered with some agitation in her voice. "I'm fine, I can still handle it. The system is failing due to the constant electromagnetic pulses, and 2 beams hit us. In addition, unidentified activity is detected at the bottom of the ship, but I'm fine, I think it couldn't be worse," Natasha said with great concentration, but from one moment to the next, she hears the hatch of the airship open, and the captain's shout of denial to Tony, who ignores it. No more than 8 seconds pass, and in a sudden moment, Izuku had to step aside, and avoid a few kilos of Tony's armor, crashing into a panel of the ship. The most painful thing was that the impact received Captain America, who was sent Iron Man, as if the armor were a ball, but made of steel. Izuku could see carefully that the individual who caused this was a strange man with long blonde hair. If Izuku had any opinions about that individual, it would be that, after Tony, this guy was the closest thing to a hero. This man wore a black suit with silver embroidery and designs, sleeveless, and a red cape. He wore black leather pants and high boots made of the same material, although thicker, as his suit. And like the cape, they wore embroidered patches. On each of his arms, he wore silver bracelets, and in his right hand, he carried a large mallet, very large for such a short handle. Although Izuku could deduce that the man hit Tony with that hammer, he assumed it because of the dent in the armor on his right chest. He was definitely strong, and from the constant sparks emanating from his body, it meant that, in some way, he was responsible for this electrical storm that manifested abnormally. The intruder approached Loki aggressively, grabbing Loki's throat with extreme force. And from the force and suffocation Loki was experiencing, Izuku got an idea of how strong the electric intruder was. He didn't even hesitate to pull Loki against him, tearing off the strength and safety belt that imprisoned Loki as if it were nothing. Then, that guy began to swing his heavy hammer, which hummed loudly as it spun. Grabbing the leather belt attached to the handle, he extended the hammer outwards. As a result, the hammer dragged him with its weight into the void, moving away from the ship in seconds along with the Nordic fugitive. Tony lifted his armored body from the metal floor of the ship in annoyance, while with the help of the reconnaissance intelligence he created, he located that guy with the hammer, who was already 2 kilometers away and moving away. The sequins on his helmet shone dangerously, he would take this act personally. "And there's another one," Iroman said, growling in annoyance. It was obvious he was angry. He hadn't even been able to react to the Asgardian, and he had caused a dent in his armor. Not even the US budget would be enough to buy 20 of their armor. That irritated him. "Is it another Asgardian?" Izuku asked as he activated One for All. Using his vision, he could clearly see where the subject had landed. A small plain of stones, on one of the many rocky mountains in the area. "Is he one of us?" Captain America asked with some curiosity, as he got up from the ground in some pain. He wouldn't wish it upon anyone to be someone else's shock absorber, and that said a lot. Roman grabbed his shield and prepared for what was about to happen. "That doesn't matter anymore. If you free Loki or kill him, we lose the third act," Roman said seriously, while turning his back on those present, standing at the edge of the ship's hatch. He had obtained confirmation from his quasi-artificial intelligence that the target had stopped at a certain location, even calculating the distance and a contingency plan to deal with the new Nordic being that suddenly appeared. Watching him prepare to fly away with his thrusters, the captain spoke seriously at what Tony clearly planned to do. It was clear that the billionaire underestimated the Nordics. "Stark, we need a plan of attack," the captain said seriously, but a Roman interrupted him. He was definitely very confident in his technology. "I have a plan." "Attack," he said arrogantly, while flying off in a considerable burst of speed. Then, seeing Iron Man's madness, Izuku spoke. "I'll follow him. He doesn't know it, but if he faces the Hammer Nordic, he won't come out of the fight alive. His armor won't protect him," Izuku said, surprising the captain. "How are you sure of that?" Izuku asked with curiosity and seriousness, while Izuku only satisfied his curiosity. "You saw his hammer, right? And if I told you that hammer weighs so much that it could leave a kilometer-wide crater if it fell from this height, would you believe me?" Izuku said, but the captain spoke to him directly. There was no time for metaphors or comparisons. "Get to the point, Midoriya," the captain said seriously, so Izuku just got to the point. "If that hammer is that heavy, then that Norse god possesses even greater strength, enough to wield that weapon as if it were the hammer you would use in your garage to fix the fence," Izuku said, while the captain just nodded. "I understand. Too strong, Tony will end up skinned," he said while squeezing his shield very tightly. He had to do something. "I'll see you down below," Izuku said and then flew off at great speed. 3 seconds later, an explosive boom is heard, produced by Izuku, who broke the sound barrier with great ease. Between the icy and rocky mountains, the man in the red cape and the hammer landed on a rocky cliff. However, Loki was not so lucky, and was slammed into the ground aggressively, cracking the ground in the process. Loki groaned from the pain he inflicted on his back from that brutal landing. But he couldn't be blamed, since even the place itself on that plane trembled from the impact. In any case, Loki began to laugh maliciously, while looking at that guy, his brother. His foster brother, to be exact, who was carrying the weapon he so coveted, and which he would never have. On the other hand, that guy with the hammer was furious. His anger could even be felt, the lightning was thundering loudly. He glared at the delighted Loki, speaking demandingly. "Where's the third act?" asked the guy with the hammer, but didn't find the answer he wanted. "It's nice to see you too, little brother," said Loki, slowly getting up from the ground. The burly man with the hammer was aware that Loki would start his games, but he was infuriated by what was happening right now. "Do I look like I'm joking to you?" questioned the guy with the hammer, while his sharp eyes promised crushing pain with his heavy hammer. However, Loki didn't care about his brother's condition, and spoke calmly and confidently in front of him. "Hey, thank me, with the Bifrost destroyed, how much dark energy did the Allfather have to use to send you here? To your precious land?" He said this last bit with venom in his words, exhausting the patience of that guy. The man dropped the hammer on the ground, causing the entire mountain to shudder. But magically, he managed to stay on the ground without it destroying the mountain, although he couldn't prevent it from instantly creating a crater around it. The guy didn't care about such an event and quickly approached Loki. Almost instantly, the guy aggressively grabbed Loki's neck and looked furiously into his eyes. The gazes of both brothers were penetrating, as if an epic battle between true Norsemen would break out at any second. However, from one moment to the next, that guy relaxed his hard gaze, and surprisingly, looked at his brother with pity and true concern. The latter expressed his distress towards his brother, and spoke to him gently. "I thought you were dead. I thought you were gone." The man confessed sincerely, looking into his brother's eyes. Loki, on the other hand, remained neutral in the face of his brother's sincere words. "And did you suffer?" the Norse god asked dryly. "Of course I did. And not just me. Our father." The man explained, but suddenly he was cut off by Loki, who raised his left hand, showing his index finger. "Your father, Thor. Your father," he said, while abruptly separating himself from the aforementioned. That man named Thor just took a step back, while looking seriously at Loki. Loki walked past Thor calmly, while his anger began to seep from his body. All that hatred and resentment towards his people was expressed in a few simple questions. "He told you my origins, right?" Loki said with frustration and disappointment in those words. And as he heard his brother's silence confirming his question, he began to descend the mountain, clutching the small of his back. He still felt that blow. Being a god didn't mean he felt pain. As for Thor, he simply remained calm and then approached Loki, following his brother's descent. "We both grew up together. We played together, we fought together. Have you forgotten all this?" Thor expressed forcefully, while Loki suddenly stopped. The god of lies directed a cold look at his brother and spoke. I was a shadow of you. Facing the shadow of your greatness. I remember well that you threw me into an abyss, I who was, and should have been, king. Loki spat venomously at his brother, while wrinkling his brow at the memory. And you attacked the world I love to make up for those supposed outrages? No. The earth is under my protection, Loki. Thor said with authority, but only received Loki's mockery. The god of lies approached Thor with grace, and shamelessly expressed his sarcasm. And you're doing a good job taking care of it. Humans massacre each other. I want to rule them, I don't see why not. Loki said seriously, while facing his brother. And that's why you think you're better than them, right? Thor asked harshly. Well, of course I am. Loki said calmly, drawing a small ironic smile from his brother. Do you still not understand the meaning of ruling? You don't deserve a throne. Thor expressed harshly to his brother, provoking a sudden outburst of anger from his stepbrother, who pushed him aside, moving away a little from him. Then, as he followed him, Loki exclaimed firmly. I've seen worlds you can't imagine. I've grown, son of Odin. In my exile, I've seen the power of the third act. And when I used it, Loki said, but was suddenly interrupted by Thor. Who taught you its power? Thor asked seriously, but found no answer. However, he insisted, thinking that if someone knows how to use that power, then without Dita they were a threat that couldn't be ignored. Who controls the supposed king? The god who wielded the hammer asked again, but only received the sudden wrath of his furious brother. I am the king, Loki shouted angrily. But was grabbed by his robes by Thor, who yelled at him furiously. But you are not king here. Give back the third act and your poisoned dream, brother. Return to our world, Thor demanded, accompanied by an imperceptible plea in his words. And yet his response was a sinister smile from Loki, who looked him in the eyes and answered. I don't have one, he said with a sinister smile, infuriating his brother Thor. There was no point in continuing to talk to him. Thor had already confirmed that Loki was simply playing with him. Feeling his blood boil, Thor's right arm extended towards the hammer. As if on command, the hammer began to whir rapidly, and instantly flew into Thor's hand. Gripping the handle tightly, Thor glared at his brother, ready to take him home by force. On the other hand, Loki widened his sinister smile and spoke slyly to his exasperating brother. You need the bucket to send me home, but I sent it far away and I don't know where it is, Loki said capriciously. Tired of Loki's words, Thor points his heavy hammer in front of Loki and looks at him seriously. Listen to me carefully, brother, Thor threatened with indescribable murderous intent, yet his words were cut short as he was rammed by Tony and his armor. I'm listening, the Norse god of lies joked with a mocking smile. At least he'd be entertained by a bizarre fight between the armored man and his brother. But the question was this, how long would Iron Man hesitate before Thor turned him into a pulp? He'd find out. Deep into the mountains, Tony dragged Thor against his will, and as a predetermined revenge, he went through a few pine trees before dropping Thor to the ground while delivering a double kick, powered by his jetpacks. As Tony had predicted, the Norse god fell face first into the ground, while his face had traveled more than 10 meters away, dragging his neck with it. It wasn't until Thor decided to take control of his body that Thor saw Thor calmly recover, seeing that apart from the dirt, he was completely unharmed. Thor tightened his grip on his hammer and turned his hard face toward Tony, who, raising the front of his helmet, fixed his face on Thor's with indifference. Then, standing face to face, Thor spoke. Don't do that again, Thor threatened, his intent murderous. But Tony didn't care what Thor thought and replied. And you don't mess with my business, Tony said indifferently. You have no idea what you're dealing with, or who you're dealing with, Thor clarified seriously, giving Tony the benefit of the doubt. The billionaire, however, mocked Thor's words and spoke sarcastically. Shakespeare in the park? Does your mother know that you use her curtains? Joked Iron Man with exaggeration and sarcasm in front of a serious Thor, who was running out of patience. This is bigger than you, Metal Man. Loki will face Asgardian justice, said Thor without much patience, while his seriousness was reflected on his face. When he returns the cube to us, it will be yours. Until then, do not get in the way. Were the egocentric words of Tony, while the front of his helmet was sawed off. Tired of the stupid words of that metal man, Thor expressed his disdain towards Tony, throwing his heavy hammer at an unsuspecting Tony, who expressed some jokes referring to a foreigner. As a result, Tony could not respond to that attack, and without being able to avoid it, it was Iron Man's turn to be rammed by a heavy hammer that sent him flying more than 100 meters in a straight line. Crashing through tree trunk after tree trunk over 4 meters thick, It wasn't until Thor reached out and brought his hammer down toward him that Tony finally kissed the ground, creating a trench similar to the one Thor had created. Evidently, the suit's system was beginning to fail. Scratches and dents in his suit were noticeable, indicating that he would have a tough time trying to stop Thor. But hey, that was Tony, and all he could manage was a few simple words. "Okay, you asked for it," said Tony, very annoyed, as he prepared for battle again. Thor fixed his gaze towards the highest hill of the rocky mountain where Loki was smiling. So he grabbed the leather handle, swung the hammer with great force and speed. However, when he was about to ascend to the sky, Thor was sent flying a few meters in a straight line against a giant tree, piercing it in the process. Annoyed by Tony's attack, Thor got up to face his opponent, but Tony was already very close to him. Unexpectedly, Tony hit Thor with a double kick channeled with propulsive beam attacks, sending the Norse god flying like a doll a few meters away, piercing another tree in the process. The dust dissipated over time, and to Tony's annoyance, the Norse god had not suffered any damage. In fact, he hadn't even burned his clothes or anything, he'd just been pushing him with his attacks. Annoyed by his failed attempts, Thor launched himself at Thor, attempting to utilize the raw power of his armor. When he was close enough to engage in hand-to-hand combat, Thor realized that this was an incredibly bad idea. It wasn't long before Thor was sent flying through the air by the Asgardians' crushing force, understanding why the captain's pride was so hurt. He was being beaten. Thor managed to stabilize himself in the air in time, then deploy mini-missiles from his metallic shoulders, causing them all to explode in front of the Asgardian, creating great devastation in the explosion. However, amid the smoke resulting from the future start of a forest fire, Thor's hammer traveled faster than Thor could react, striking him in the chest and knocking him to the ground. Thor barely had time to ration himself and dodge a stomp from the Norse god that created a small crater. But with the small window of time, Thor launched two powerful propulsion beams in order to knock the Norse god off his feet. But without warning, Thor grew bored of the Tin Man's insistence and raised his hammer to the sky. As if responding to his call, the thunderstorm overhead concentrated a large electrical charge, and suddenly, a column of lightning struck the hammer, as if it were a lightning rod. The columns of electricity illuminated the area, disturbing Thor, but he was too late to evade the lightning attack. Well, he couldn't evade something that traveled at the speed of light, after all. It was Thor's turn to launch lightning attacks, and he attacked Thor directly, further damaging the disgustingly intelligent billionaire's armor. For 4 seconds, that attack of pure energy tried to split or pierce him, trying to force the armor's invulnerability. And fortunately, the armor had survived Thor's lightning attack. Although Thor wasn't surprised either, in his defense, it didn't give him enough of a charge. On the other hand, Tony smiled wryly when he was warned that because of the attack that tried to fry him alive, he now had 400% energy in the suit. And with that in mind, his ego inflated again, then he deployed all that energy he had obtained in that attack. Using the reactor in his chest, he aimed it at Thor, who was approaching at great speed. The result was something that exceeded Tony's expectations, and surprised the Norse god. From Tony's chest, a lightning bolt so powerful came out that when it impacted with Thor, the Norse god was sent flying hundreds of meters, being covered by the lightning that came out of Tony's chest, which made the owner retreat due to its power. A straight line of destruction was left in sight by that death ray fired by Tony's suit, and since it couldn't be ignored, a snort of arrogance wasn't missed by Tony towards his opponent, wherever he ended up. "It was simple," Tony said with some arrogance, forgetting that his suit was almost falling apart from the beating he was being dealt by a disinterested storm god. As long as he was the winner with his detonating range, the most feasible in his mind, he would settle for the result, even if his suit was starting to fail. But, unfortunately, that was far from reality. Just as he was about to turn around, the sudden thunderous roars of the storms began to shake the sky aggressively. Lightning began to transform the atmosphere, and the fire and the sudden strong winds began to highlight a clear post-apocalyptic landscape. And then, focusing his gaze on the destruction of his attack, he could clearly notice that brightness, that intense celestial glow emanating from constant lightning. Like the great herald he was, Thor was in the distance, tightly gripping the handle of his heavy, disproportionate, and electrifying hammer. He was furious, and the Iron Man was crying out for blood. The blood of that Tin Man, the one who had forced Thor to take him seriously. In those moments, Iron Man could only say one word. Shit. That was what he said. And in a sudden moment, Tony used all the power of his propulsion to get out of where he was, saving his life. At that precise moment, Thor appeared as if by magic, with sheer speed alone, and with a war cry, he slammed his heavy hammer into the ground, causing an incredibly strong tremor around 4 kilometers in all directions. At the spot where the hammer hit, it created a sonic boom that created a kinetic wave that uprooted entire trees around 50 meters in an area, while creating a crater about 15 meters in size, and about 5 meters deep. Tony's disbelief was very clear, realizing that it was at this precise moment that this Asgardian would take him seriously. He wasn't ready to continue the battle, not with a suit like that, not with the one he had. He needed to go to his garage and look for another suit, maybe with more power, and maybe. Who was he kidding? There wasn't a suit that would allow him to fight the Norse god right now, not with someone that strong. Even if he hated this reality, he knew that if for some reason, Thor hit him, he would be a massive human sausage, and in the most literal way possible. Thor didn't take his terrifying gaze off Tony, who was trying to escape from Thor, but by spinning the hammer, it instantly rises against Tony, and grabs him by the right arm. Tony panics when he feels the grip of the Norse god, and knowing what would happen next, he disconnects the precise part of the armor to free his arm from its protection, which was destroyed with just a squeeze of Thor's wrist. On the other hand, Thor realizes what Tony did, so with Mjolnir in his hands, he hits Tony's torso, causing him to crash abruptly into the forest. Tony wastes no time and abruptly gets up from his place, to step aside by instinct. Because, at that precise moment, the Mjolnir passed by him, crashing into a mountain, and destroying part of it. And yet, Tony couldn't rest when he had an enraged Thor just a few meters away, who was approaching running towards him. In order to survive, Tony deposited a large part of his energy into his left propulsion to lash out a devastating beam at Thor. But unfortunately for the Tin Man, now dented all over, Thor raised his arm and grabbed Mjolnir to protect himself, causing the attack to fail. Then, when he was only a meter away from being hit by Thor, Tony ran out of ideas. His disbelief became clear when the God of Thunder raised his right arm, signaling that he would crush him like the time he wiped out 50 meters of soil and fauna. Then, just as he was about to be sentenced, something unexpected, and gratifying for the billionaire, happened. An emerald light appeared, and in the blink of an eye, Izuku had appeared in front of Thor, who was surprised by the appearance of the boy emanating pure power. Then, with a smash, Izuku connected with a punch to Thor's jaw, creating an incredibly powerful impact that began to destroy hundreds of meters of land due to the resulting pressure of the force exerted on the physical power of the fist. Tony was sent flying by the resulting impact, but was stopped by a tree and the captain, who had landed in time. As the dust began to fade, Tony was left in disbelief at what he saw, including the captain's, as he watched Izuku's display of strength. The young man approached the two men and turned his attention back to Tony. As he had assumed from the beginning, the billionaire couldn't fight the Nordic creature, and his suit said it all. His disbelief became clear when the God of Thunder raised his right arm, signaling that he would crush him like the time he wiped out 50 meters of soil and fauna. Then, just as he was about to be sentenced, something unexpected, and gratifying for the billionaire, happened. An emerald light appeared, and in the blink of an eye, Izuku had appeared in front of Thor, who was surprised by the appearance of the boy emanating pure power. Then, with a smash, Izuku connected with a punch to Thor's jaw, creating an incredibly powerful impact that began to destroy hundreds of meters of land due to the resulting pressure of the force exerted on the physical power of the fist. Tony was sent flying by the resulting impact, but was stopped by a tree and the captain, who had landed in time. As the dust began to fade, Tony was left in disbelief at what he saw, including the captain's, as he watched Izuku's display of strength. The young man approached the two men and turned his attention back to Tony. As he had assumed from the beginning, the billionaire couldn't fight the Nordic creature, and his suit said it all. His disbelief became clear when the God of Thunder raised his right arm, signaling that he would crush him like the time he wiped out 50 meters of soil and fauna. Then, just as he was about to be sentenced, something unexpected, and gratifying for the billionaire, happened. An emerald light appeared, and in the blink of an eye, Izuku had appeared in front of Thor, who was surprised by the appearance of the boy emanating pure power. Then, with a smash, Izuku connected with a punch to Thor's jaw, creating an incredibly powerful impact that began to destroy hundreds of meters of land due to the resulting pressure of the force exerted on the physical power of the fist. Tony was sent flying by the resulting impact, but was stopped by a tree and the captain, who had landed in time. As the dust began to dim, Tony was left in disbelief at what he saw, including the captain's, as he watched Izuku's display of strength. The young man approached the two men and turned his attention back to Tony. As he had assumed from the beginning, the billionaire couldn't fight the Nordic creature, and his suit said it all. "Are you okay?" Izuku asked Tony, hoping he wasn't affected by the experience. "And yet, I had it under control," Tony said, while his suit emitted a few sparks, possibly from a short circuit. Captain America, on the other hand, owed a glance to the massive destruction Izuku caused and noticed Tony's poor condition. "I'm glad you're okay," Stark, as Steve said seriously, while only receiving a disinterested nod from Tony. And good hit, Midoriya. I think, on this occasion, it was good that you used all your strength. This enemy was very powerful, more so than Loki, as you supposed he would be. The captain congratulated him, while Izuku only felt somewhat uncomfortable. Maybe it was a good idea to think about keeping it to himself, since in reality, he only used less than 10% of his power. Izuku knew that he was now 10 times stronger than his master at his prime. He couldn't just say that he had the power to explode and reduce an entire continent to rocks and stones if he was in a bad mood. Maybe I hurt him, but he's still alive. I only temporarily pushed him away, Izuku said calmly, leaving the two men in disbelief. But when Tony was about to refuse to believe such an assumption due to the impact resulting from that blow, Thor appeared from the sky, landing in an epic and authoritarian manner, while his neutral face was fixed on a serious Izuku. He didn't even notice that Tony was pointing his lightning at him, while the captain had his shield guarding him. He just remained silent, while he felt the taste of his blood from his split lip. The silence seemed eternal and the bruise from Izuku's blow began to show on Thor's face. And after a minute of silence, Izuku just stopped floating, and deactivated his power, impressing Tony and the captain. Then, Izuku looks at Thor, and speaks to him. Have you calmed down yet? Izuku asked seriously, while waiting for Thor's answer. Then Thor gave a heavy sigh on his own and answered. Yes, I'm calm, Thor said, while placing his hammer on the ground as a show of confidence. Captain America lowers his shield, and Tony deactivates his only arm thruster. The four give a sigh of relaxation, and proceed to understand each other as they should have done from the beginning.